This is Echo 3, and let's discuss making and landing a MUN surface base. If you like my content, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. The subject of this video was recommended by Nuke Game Reactor. Normally, I do not care to make stations or bases, but the Breaking Ground DLC, combined with the new Some Reassembly Required update, offered some purpose and functionality to making surface bases. For this mission, we'll be launching a couple different segments to begin setting up our MUN base. This first section will be the main power hub for our outpost. Since I plan to set up this base on the MUN's side that faces Kerbin, it will have to deal with about 19 hours of continuous darkness. That is why this craft has a large amount of electrical capacity. My initial plan was to send this to the MUN's south pole so that I could land on a high peak and have near constant sunlight. The terrain on the poles is very rough, and I was unable to find a suitable landing site for a multi-craft base. Instead, I opted for a flat spot along the MUN's equator. The docking ports on the side are for additional base segments to attach to this one. I decided to get double use out of the docking ports. They will decouple the fuel and engines once the craft is landed. Not that it was needed, but I put a relay dish on top. That was mostly for looks. However, the grip pads on the bottom are functional. They will help keep this from sliding around. The auto struts were also important. The craft liked to wobble when the engines were firing, so they help keep everything stable in flight. This section itself isn't too special, but we do have to figure out how to get it into orbit and then to the MUN. We can close the whole thing in fairing and stick a big rocket on the bottom. The upper section has more than enough delta V to go from low Kerbin orbit and land on the MUN. So we'll just put this big fuel segment on here, put on a big engine, and it's got a lot of drag at the top, so I'll need to put some fins on the bottom to keep it stable during launch. Other than that, I think this thing's ready to launch. Let's take it to the pad now. The craft itself is a bit awkward, but we get it into orbit without any major difficulties. You can see my discussion on launch profiles for more details. I do end up having some problems with the upper stage Terrier engines and fuel tanks. You'll be able to see that here once we get this into orbit. For some reason, the engines were only using fuel off of one of the fuel tanks. I checked, I couldn't see any problems with the docking ports causing issues. I really don't know what was causing the problems, but I transfer some fuel and it does eventually seem to work. What I end up doing though is I cut out the whole transfer to the MUN so you don't get to see all the maneuvers. If you are curious on how to get to the MUN, I do have a tutorial that covers more on that. You don't just get to see it here. But you can watch the landing where I make a mistake. My carelessness resulted in the craft kind of flipping over when I decouple these segments, and I land and break one of the solar panels. Fortunately, with the new update, we can repair it. We'll be all right. Our second base section will house the crew and carry our EVA construction parts and breaking ground science experiments. The craft will share many similarities with the first, such as the same probe core on the bottom and the use of grippy pads to help keep it from moving around. I'm adding a few ladders just to help with crew getting in and out. Like the first craft, I'm going to have some kind of landing system, but this time I'm going to use more of a sky crane approach. I found that this worked a lot better. I did have to put the engines pretty far out. It seemed that the exhaust was running into the grip pads, so I just made sure to give them lots of room, and this ends up working pretty well. A few batteries just to make sure we don't run out of power. To connect the two craft, I'm using the robotic parts. All I will need to do is land close to the first base segment, then I can move the robotic parts to make the connection. Notice then that I am strutting the robotic parts in place. This would have been a bad idea before the 1.11 update, but now it makes sense. Now we're going to just load up the container with all the parts and science experiments that we're going to need. We can actually hold quite a bit in this big container. I'm going to make sure I add some repair kits. Because I broke that solar panel, I'll need 4 repair kits to fix it. Then we'll put an engineer and a scientist in this thing, and we should be pretty good for the base segment itself. Now we need to get this into space. I'm going to put a big fairing on this like I did the last one and build the rest of the rocket. I think for the middle stage, I'm going to use a Poodle engine for all of our orbital maneuvers. The Poodle engine seems to have the right amount of thrust-to-weight ratio and specific impulse. It ends up working out pretty well, and it'll get us all the way from low Kerbin orbit and begin our descent on the Mun. Lastly, we're going to need some kind of big booster to get this into space. I'm going to take advantage of the Making History DLC and use those 5-meter parts. Throw on a couple vector engines, and I think we're going to have a pretty good ascent stage to get this into orbit. Like the other one, I'm going to add a few fins just to keep it stable on launch. Double check our staging, add a few auto struts, make sure we're going to be stable, and I think we're ready to launch this one as well. Again, the ascent profile is uneventful. After we get this thing into space, we'll create our maneuver nodes to go out to the Mun. I did reduce the vectoring ability on these engines to about 30% of what they normally could do. It just doesn't need that much gimbal range on the vector engines. We will get this thing into orbit and circularize our first stage base that they got us into orbit. The new, that's actually not that new, but if you notice, I'm using the maneuver node editor down there on the bottom left. You can do a lot of cool things with it. Like I can just type in a number, say like 846 meters per second of delta V into prograde, and just plot that in there and then move the node around until I get the right encounter with the Mun. And then I can even adjust things and get pretty precise with this. So I want a low periapsis around the Mun where we will make a retrograde maneuver and get us into orbit. If you are unfamiliar with getting to the Mun, I have some tutorials on that. Actually, I have several tutorials on going to the Mun and landing on the Mun. You can check those out if you have more questions on how to do that. So after we circularize around the Mun, I've noticed our landing site is now in the dark. So we're going to wait several orbits here, actually quite a few in-game days. So we'll be in the light. This is just mostly for the recording purposes. I can land in the dark. It'll just be easier to see everything on the light side of the Mun. Our inclination isn't perfect, so we'll have to make a small change there to line up with our base location. And I'm going to use the maneuver node editor just to give me an idea of how much delta V and what timing I need to start this deorbit burn. Pretty much I want to line up directly overhead and try to come almost straight down on this rather than doing like a really efficient suicide burn. I'm trying to land in a very precise location. While we have a little bit of play with the robotic parts, I'm still going to have to land within a few meters of my other segment. In order to facilitate this, I'm using Kerbal Engineer and I'm using the landing prediction. You can do this without the mod. It just made things a lot easier. That's what that red bullseye is. That's going to tell me exactly where I'm going to land, and it really helps me pinpoint this landing. I always recommend this mod. It is one of the most useful mods probably out there, and we're going to land really, really close, and that will get us. Once we land, I'll be able to use these thrusters again just to line up perfectly, and then we can eject this sky crane. Now, because I had the engineer, I can undo the parts, and now that that strut's out of the way, we can put these robotic parts down and actually dock with the other craft. Some people like to use a rover approach to docking base segments. That works great, but I had the Breaking Ground DLC, so I'm going to take advantage of that as well. And we are connected. I undid the power on those motors. It gives a little bit more free play on those parts. I don't know, just in case the base needs to wiggle a little bit. I'm hoping it prevents Kraken attacks. My engineer is now out, and he's going to go over and fix that broken solar panel. He had the repair kits in his inventory. Right-click on there and repair, and we're done. Now I'm going to grab this strut and move it over. If you notice there on the top right of the screen is an icon that kind of looks like a crane hook. I can use it to move parts from the inventory and put it out where I want it. It doesn't actually have to go into the Kerbals inventory to do this. As long as the engineer is close, this all works. Some people are saying, hey, the part is too heavy for my Kerbal to carry, it's too big, whatever. This is how you do that. Just as long as the Kerbal's close, it puts the part down. Now I'm using the Kerbal's inventory, so I can take these parts a little further away than the container would normally let me place them, and I can put these science experiments further out. Other things you might want to consider if you're going to add on to a base like this would be to put one of the mobile processing labs down there, or some kind of in situ resource utilization and drills, so you can make a big fueling base. I probably would also consider some kind of rover docking station and make this a central hub for exploring the Mun. Well, this is how I had fun designing my Mun base. You can take these ideas as you'd like. I'm Echo 3, and thanks for joining me to discuss making and landing Mun surface bases. I'll see you next time.